Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers and I'm the principal of Massey College. It's my great privilege to welcome you here on this very special session of our Massey Dialogues. But first, let me acknowledge that Massey College is built on Indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. It is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward this land and the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. So this is a very special session of our Massey Dialogues. Massey College has a mission to nourish learning and serve the public good, and we are particularly concerned to ensure that our community is well informed on the issues of the day. So I am particularly delighted to have our diplomat in residence, Rosemary McCarney, to be there to help us reflect on the role of NATO in this terrible tragedy that's unfolding in Ukraine right now. So without further ado, Rosemary.
Natalie and I had a conversation about 4 days ago that there were so many questions and misinformation and disinformation. We have a good sense of that nowadays, but also the need for informed public debate and opinion, and particularly with respect to the scope of policy responses when you're confronted with sudden acts of aggression, and in this case, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so in the face of real-time visual and graphic details from the ground because of the use of social media and the accessibility of mobile devices, etc., we're leaning in and feeling like we're participating in real-time efforts. And so that has led to a range of opinions, of military advice and strategy from people across the country and across the world who quickly became strategists on defense policy and military policy, because people feel the need to speak and they feel the need to contribute. And what we wanted to do here at Massey was to maybe up the literacy levels of everyone so that they can think about what are the options? What is the NATO alliance? What can it do? Should it do? Should not do? And so when you look at some of the social media platforms and opinion editorials, etc., people are calling for no-fly zones. People are saying no to no-fly zones, or rapid deployment of this or that, supply chains, etc. And sometimes I think we've sat back here at Massey over the last few days and went, I wish they had a little bit more factual information on which to base some of the opinions and suggestions and the quality of the debate. And so Massey's the place to do that. And with all, as Natalie said, it's a place where we bring seasoned experts and practitioners and students and networks of wise people who can come together and have an informed discussion. And today we've assembled three of those experts: a former Canadian defense minister, a former Canadian ambassador to NATO, and the current ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany to Canada. So welcome to all of you and welcome to our panelists. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pose a few questions to the panel, and then we want to open it up for questions for those of you here in the room and for those who are online. And please post your questions into the chat and we'll try and gather them. But let me introduce you to the panelists a little bit right now. You've seen their bios, so I will be very brief and not do justice to them. But the Honorable David Collenette probably doesn't need a great deal of introduction. In this setting, he was a member of Parliament for Toronto for 21 years. He served 3 prime ministers. He held a host of cabinet portfolios for over a decade for those 3 prime ministers, including transport, veterans affairs, but also most importantly for our conversation today, as Minister of Defense during a very interesting and important period for NATO. Our second guest that I'd like to introduce to you today is our visiting ambassador, the ambassador for Germany, Sabine Sparwasser. Sabine started her career in journalism before she joined the government of Germany, where she's held several posts, but she's no stranger to Toronto or to Massey College. I didn't realize until over the weekend that she was in fact a member of the Quadrangle Society. She was our Consul General of Germany to Toronto, so has spent years here, is married to a Canadian, and I think we should note that you choose your partners very wisely from my perspective. So thank you, Sabine, for that. And but more importantly, with respect to Germany and Europe, last week, there's so much perspective that we also want to bring to that conversation. And now, as the ambassador of Germany to Canada since 2017, she's in a terrific position to bridge the European perspective, German perspective, in Canada. And then finally, and definitely not least, we have our former ambassador to NATO, Kerry Buck, who is also well known. She's a senior fellow at the Graham Center for Contemporary History. She's a senior fellow at Ottawa U. She's held diplomatic posts in various parts of the world, held senior positions in many of the most challenging portfolios in the Canadian government, has spent her career, most of her career, in foreign affairs and foreign relations in Canada. And as our ambassador to NATO, very, very recently, Kerry comes with a very strong and unique perspective on Canada and NATO. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for, at very short notice, giving of your time today and your guidance and perspectives and experience. So David, I'm going to start with you, if I could. So the Ukraine today and the Russian invasion, they have unleashed public opinion on war and conflict and military strategy, as I said, in a quite spectacular way, as social media platforms have collided with real-time phone videos and citizens reporting from the ground. NATO's an institution that people assume they understand, but it's not always been well understood. But now it's being discussed very publicly in a way that I don't think I've ever seen in my memory. And it seems to me that there's quite a bit of confusion in the public calls for no-fly zones, for forward stationing, for supplies of weapons, etc. Particularly for those who are members or aspiring members to NATO. And we've seen lots of discussion this past couple of weeks of why isn't Ukraine a member? What about Finland? What about Sweden? And so on and so forth. And then it's, the issue of the threat of weapons as well. So I imagine that you can set the table for us very well from your years of experience as defense minister and your active involvement today on the issues of NATO and NATO enlargement, the origins and founding premises of NATO. So if you could set the table for us and kind of help us with that NATO 101 side of things, that would be terrifically valuable.
Thank you very much, Rosemary. It's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon and our two colleagues from the ambassadorial ranks. Your question really is rather broad and there's very little time, but people must know that NATO was established after the Second World War as a defensive alliance to protect all of us so that we wouldn't have to go through what we went through in the Second World War again. And the two adversaries at the time, believe it or not, were Germany and the Soviet Union. But then Germany moved more and more into our orbit and became a member of NATO in 1955. Spain joined in 1982. So over the years, the alliance gradually grew. And its main job is a defensive one, as I said, to protect the members from attack. Principally, in the Cold War years, it was from the Soviet Union. I was there was an initiation from Chancellor Kohl from Germany and my colleague Volker Ruhr, who was a defense minister, to invite former members of the Warsaw Pact to join. And President Clinton supported that and talked to Mr. Krejcin, and we worked hard on expansion of NATO. It was originally called Partnership for Peace. And three countries, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, became members in 1999. And of course, there's been a subsequent expansion. We've now gone up to 30 members. So that's sort of like the institutional background. And a lot of people believe that this disgraceful, terrible, horrendous conflict that's going on right now is as a result of the potential of Ukraine joining NATO. And Mr. Putin has been saying that, you swear off of that and you're okay. That's not the case. We saw with his speech, which was almost incoherent a week or so ago, that there's a wider design here. It's a wider design to restore, Imperial Russia, or the Russia of the Soviet years, to go back 30 years to the Cold War and to increase the Russian influence. And of course, member nations, NATO nations, and others. Not all European nations are members of NATO, as you've mentioned Sweden, you've mentioned Finland, there's Austria, but nations are helping Ukraine. But NATO is not going to Ukraine's defense in an institutional way. And a lot of people are saying, well, this is, what's NATO there for? The NATO has to be very, very careful. We're dealing with a nuclear power. And we don't know how rational Mr. Putin is. And certainly some of his statements lead you to believe that he is certainly really becoming somewhat less rational than one should, leading a large country like that. And so if NATO then embarks on a formal defense of Ukraine not being a member of NATO, then this causes, in effect, institutional issues, but it also will beget a very difficult response from the Russians. And there is potential for nuclear escalation, and we can talk about that a little later. A lot of people in recent days, including President Zelensky, have advocated a no-fly zone. We had a no-fly zone in the war in the former Yugoslavia, which NATO enforced, but that was with the blessing of the UN. Well, the UN is not going to ask NATO to interfere in Ukraine because guess what? Russia has a veto at the Security Council. So, and the moment that NATO as an institution agrees to a no-fly zone, it has to be enforced, and it's enforced with Canadian, American, German, French, all the nations, Poles, planes. And then you've really declared war on Russia. It's very difficult. It's tragic for the people of Ukraine, but certainly we want to contain the conflict there. We don't want a European-wide conflagration going on. So NATO has some difficult issues and difficult choices, but NATO, I believe, has sort of increased in the consciousness of people around the world, and with the citizens of individual countries. And certainly, Mr. Putin has done something that he never imagined. He has actually revivified NATO. He has given us a new purpose and a reason to increase our budgets and to ensure that we have all of the necessary things that we can do to defend. Because if Ukraine, unfortunately, should fall, if the Russians actually win in Ukraine, then it's quite obvious from what he has said in the last 2 weeks, other former Soviet countries, formerly in the Russian orbit, will be next, like the Baltic republics, and then we have a problem, because that will be an attack on NATO, and an attack on one is an attack on all, and then we are into really a third world war. So the stakes are extremely high, and that is why there has to be a negotiated settlement. There's got to be some rationale, some reasoning to prevail. Sorry, that's a long answer to your incredibly broad question.
It was a broad question, but you did set things up very beautifully for the conversation today. So thank you for that. And it's actually your last comments lead very well into the question I had for Kerry regarding NATO and what can NATO do, what can NATO not do in support of Ukraine, and are there some creative discussions being held today in terms of what's possible that may not have been considered before? So, Kerry.
Thanks, Rosemary. So I'll start with what NATO is doing now and say that the NATO response has been stronger and more unified than one could have hoped for. So what NATO's doing, NATO defense plans have been activated for the first time for collective defense. More troops, planes, and ships are now moving fast into the Eastern Allies to have a more robust deterrence posture in those states that might be of the alliance that might be more vulnerable. And part of that deterrence is messaging, political messaging. So the unity of messaging is really, really important. And you will have heard from NATO Sec Gen and all of the NATO leaders speaking that the message now to President Putin is that NATO territory is inviolable and will be defended. And that's a really important message to deter him from moving further. The other things that NATO's doing, NATO doesn't do this alone. So NATO-EU cooperation has been invaluable for this in terms of helping line up European states to agree and then to send weaponry, anti-aircraft and other weapons into Ukraine to help them. That's a huge shift, and the degree of cooperation between NATO and EU has been really important. But there's also other actors out there, right? G7 is an important place to coordinate sanctions and to make sure that sanctions go beyond just NATO. There'd always be some talk at NATO, but not necessarily a lot. Other things that are happening, Finland and Sweden are firmly in those discussions. There's sharing of intel. There's discussions of planning to make sure that it's almost like one consolidated response, NATO plus Sweden and Finland. And that's a pretty important shift too. And in many ways, I think we've seen US leadership reasserted. And Ukraine and the West are winning the information war. So those are all the things that NATO's doing right now. What NATO should not do. So let's tackle no-fly zone. No-fly zone, I understand completely why Ukraine wants to close their skies. They need to. The air campaign by the Russians, they don't have air superiority yet, is my understanding, but I'm not inside the tent anymore. But the air campaign is killing civilians, and it really makes Ukraine vulnerable. So I understand the desire to close the skies. But if NATO were to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine or even parts of Ukraine, that is exactly the same as NATO declaring war on Russia right now. And so the question is, people need to understand that when you say no-fly zone imposed by NATO, that's what you mean, a declaration of war against a nuclear state with what might be an increasingly erratic leader. And that is a very, very dangerous situation to be in, right? That being said, the whole push to send anti-aircraft weaponry, planes, and other equipment into Ukraine is to bolster their capacity to close their own skies. The challenge with that is that it's a really very fine line that has to be drawn. The fine line is going so far, but not becoming a combatant, seen as a co-combatant for those states that are supplying weapons, right? And the challenge is that who decides whether that line has been crossed? It's actually President Putin. And that's the difficulty. So it's a very difficult space to be in, but absolutely necessary, I think, because whatever happens in Ukraine will have an impact on NATO, one way or the other. Which leads me to your question about creative solutions. Well, no one knows where this is going to go, right? So it could go in any number of ways. Ukraine could get the upper hand. The Russian army could crumble. And then we'd be in a world of, reconstruction, rebuilding, something. Depends how long the war goes on. Or, and it's not the creative part, or Russia reaches the point where they understand that they've got more to lose from prosecuting the war further than they have to gain, and they're willing to have real talks. There are talks happening right now, and those talks are about ceasefires, humanitarian corridors. My guess is that they're not about much more than that. Ideally, there'd be talks, ceasefire, or some kind of partial withdrawal that would then allow other further wider talks to take place, right? And usually what happens is those further broader talks would involve some other state sponsors, and that would be important to give extra leverage to Ukraine in their talks with Russia. That would be a very delicate thing to figure out who the state sponsors are, so you don't, up the ante too much. But this has happened before in the Normandy format with Germany and France, Russia. It's happened with the Budapest Memorandum that guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty, that they would be free from threats of force from Russia. So ideally, there'd be broader talks, and those broader talks would involve others with a bit more heavy hitting to increase Ukraine's leverage. But we don't know. It's a very difficult time for President Zelensky, right? He has to decide how much death Ukrainians will take before it's time to move and start to signal compromise. And I would hope that his, as I said, those talks would be offset or supported by others to enhance his leverage. But we really don't know where things are going to go. And the idea of talks right now might be a bit pie in the sky, because a number of off-ramps were offered to President Putin before he launched an all-out war in Ukraine, and he drove right by all of those off-ramps. So it's a really, really dangerous space right now. And then NATO, focusing on putting more troops, consistent, solid political messaging, more air and more maritime in the eastern part of the alliance is aimed at pushing the Russians into understanding that the time may be to ease off. Sanctions are also meant to do that as well.
Thank you for that. It's very helpful in terms of the range of what's possible and what's more dangerously, the dangerous options and non-options. And you mentioned the importance of the EU and NATO cooperation right now. And so can I shift to a bit to the nuclear situation, which has raised a number of questions and concerns and opinions in the last couple of weeks. And the strong norms that have governed the use and the threat of use of nuclear weapons got challenged again by the Russian president. And, we lived through that a few years ago with the former American president and the North Koreans. And this language of implied or explicit threats to use nuclear weapons in some form, it's like, I feel like here we are again. And these norms had stood for, quite well for decades now. So when you think about, these pieces, can you help the audience kind of appreciate the perspectives in the context of NATO and NATO's nuclear doctrine? And kind of from your perspective and your experience, should we be worried?
It is a really hard question about whether we should be worried. But my 16-year-old son asked me that the other day, and I said no. So I'm going to stick with no, but let me tell you why, or what my thinking is. So when President Putin warned states, allies, of consequences such as you've never seen in your entire history, that was pretty threatening language, and it was veiled language around nuclear. But my good friend Rose Gottemoeller, who was the deputy SecGen of NATO and who's negotiated everything nuclear between Russia and the US for the past, I don't know how many decades, her take on it at the time was that this was in line with previous nuclear saber rattling from President Putin, that it was slightly less explicit than some of the language he'd used in the past. And she wasn't worried at that point. Then a few days later, what President Putin did is he announced that Russia's nuclear forces would be on special mode of combat duty. So what does that mean? Russian doctrine says they cannot move up the ladder to start to move towards potential launch if they're in peacetime. And he, of course, his approach or his description of what they're doing in Ukraine is that it's not war. It's not war. It's not an invasion. He originally called it a peacekeeping mission, then a special military operation. So, if it's not war, how do you then put your nuclear forces on higher alert? So that use of the word special mode of combat duty moved them into a different world in Russian nuclear protocols, right? Now, the other thing that happened is that a few weeks prior, the Russians had exercised some of their nuclear forces. So what that means in NATO parlance is, you do almost like a test run of your command and control, a test run of, other parts of what you would have to do in a real situation if you were to move to launch. And he did that, I think, about 3 weeks before. So both of those things are not good. They are not good. What is good, or what was pretty smart, I think, is the U.S. reaction. So between the U.S. and Russia, they own about 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. So that's what we're talking about now, that conversation between Russia and the U.S. And what U.S. didn't do is they didn't move their DEFCON levels. They didn't move up their level of defense readiness to signal that they were matching the Russian rhetoric or the Russian readiness. And I think that's really smart. And it's really smart because in nuclear kind of deterrence theory, you don't want to be seen to escalate and push your opponent into a space where their only choice is between further escalation or defeat, right? So the fact that the U.S. response was very constrained was very wise, because right now, an unpredictable escalation could or could not push Vladimir Putin into responding with tactical nuclear weapons. And that would be really, really bad. It would be really bad in the battlefield, but it'd be really bad because that taboo that you mentioned, Rosemary, against using tactical nuclear weapons, it has never been breached. And to have Vladimir Putin give himself permission to move beyond that into a world that we haven't seen before, in a very dangerous world, would not be good. Very unpredictable, very dangerous possibility of escalating. So I think it's a very high risk position we're in right now. And that's part of the reason why I think just, people saying, yes, no fly zone should be imposed because, we're going to end up dragged into a war anyway. Why not do it now? NATO leaders have an obligation to their own citizens and to NATO countries as well, not to drag them into a wider war inadvertently or because they decide to declare war on Russia. And if you think that Russia is, if we know they're a nuclear armed state, it's a very, very dangerous move to take. So my answer to my son that no, I'm not worried. I don't want to assume that the only way we're safe is if we assume the rational decisions of President Putin, because we've learned that every time we say, oh no, he won't go that far, he goes that far. So worry a bit and watch very closely. I mean, the good news is that any move of the Russians that they have their launch systems and their tactical nuclear arms kept separate. Any move to unite those bits will be seen by US and other surveillance, would be shared with NATO, and would put NATO onto a different footing immediately.
Right. So we're in watch mode. Your comment about every time you thought, no, he won't do that, and then it happened. I spent a good part of the morning on a call with Syrian, those of us who had spent a lot of time on the Syrian file, and we came together to have a conversation about the lessons from Syria and things we need to put in place with Ukraine, with people in Ukraine on the ground. Some of it's already obviously happening, but just the discussions about negotiations of the humanitarian corridors, which was used in Syria as a military strategy to actually gather data, to delay other things, etc. So it was let me just say, it was a group that was seasoned and cynical coming out of the Syria-Russia piece, but the playbook that we're watching is happening again. My suggestion is that there's a number of people in the room, and there's certainly a lot of people online. Please start posing your questions in the chat room. But if you don't mind, I know some of the people in the room who are incredible experts. We have Professor Bob Johnson here, who probably knows Russia as well as anyone. We have Robert Baines here, who is the CEO of the NATO Association of Canada. We have Hugh Siegel here, the former principal of Massey College and an erudite observer and researcher on the areas of conflict, etc. So I would invite you to go to the podium and to contribute to this conversation and dialogue, or pose questions as well. Robert, can I start with you? Thank you.
A pleasure. Thanks so much, Rosemary.
If you don't mind, introduce yourself for the group online.
Certainly.
And for Ambassador Kerry.
Of course.
Ambassador Buck.
So my name's Robert Baines, the President and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada. It's an absolute pleasure, Kerry, especially to speak to you again. It's been so long, and I just wanted to bring up a couple of points, especially when we talk about the doom and gloom of the nuclear possibilities. The kinds of social connections between the countries, the kinds of networking that goes on behind the scenes that most Canadians never get to see. I think that is something that certainly our association is trying to work hard to bring about, to try to show Canadians that is really the heart of the alliance, the hard-won relationships that came out of the Second World War and that have been building ever since, with that same unstoppable demand that never again shall we let this happen. I think that is an essential part. The part of this talk is supposed to be, kind of considering education about NATO. And I think that our association, I know Ambassador Buck and many others have continued to work towards making sure Canadians understand that this is not just a Swiss Army knife that you can pull out just when it's needed. It's something that needs to be sustained. It's something that needs to be constantly educated as far as our population is concerned. We need to make sure that all Canadians understand this is a tool that is useful for almost any situation. When there is a significant event happening on the globe, it just gives us that much more leverage. So I'd just like to thank the panelists, and then I'm not sure if Kerry, if you have any points on that, but I just wanted to make sure that point is clear. This is such an amazing alliance that behind the scenes, there are so many important connections that go on. If anybody's watching what's going on Twitter, especially, Kerry's point about the unity of message is outstanding. You just watch it almost get sickening to see the same message from so many ministers of defense, of foreign affairs, prime ministers, presidents. They're all on message, and that's because they're having bilateral meetings all the time. Right now, we've got Minister Anand in Latvia with the Prime Minister. They're just about to meet with the Secretary General, or I guess they just did, talking about the operations. So most Canadians never see that, and that's what I just think we need to maintain that knowledge amongst the Canadian population, that is something that's just absolutely essential.
Robert, before you step away from the podium, could you comment on what's going on right now, and the distinction you might make between NATO and deterrence and NATO in defense mode?
Certainly. So last Friday, I guess, there was a foreign ministers meeting, an extraordinary foreign minister meeting at NATO HQ, and there was an important signal that was brought about there. This change from deterrence, which was really set up in the wake of 2014 and the Crimea. Ambassador Buck was a huge part of setting up that. The enhanced forward presence in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Poland of each of those countries had 1,000 troops set up to be just on the point of deterrence, a very balanced attempt to inject stability and a symbolic military presence, wherein I think I am correct in saying all 30 NATO nations were included in at least one of those 4 enhanced forward presence, and that allowed us to have that symbolic, we're with you from the Canadian, from the NATO point of view, but it wasn't enough to be poking Russia in the eye, most importantly. 1,000 troops in one of those countries is nothing. Certainly, you can think about the numbers that have been discussed in the past 2 months, 190,000 Russian soldiers. So that was an important attempt to not be belligerent. Since we've seen what has happened in Ukraine, NATO is quite cognizantly switched from deterrence to defense, i.e. making sure that we have enough troops to actually defend the countries that we're supposed to be defending. So I think that that's absolutely essential and something that should be noted.
Thank you very much. And I also see Hugh Siegel making his way to the podium. Hugh, welcome. Welcome back.
Thank you. It's great to be here. When you're my age, it's great to be anywhere, actually. My question is really to push back, and I was very impressed with the coherence and thoughtfulness of Kerry's engagement on the issue. But I don't fully understand the rationale with respect to a no-fly zone. If the premise is as follows: President Putin has indicated that that would be an act of war. President Putin has begun to indicate that countries like Poland and others who are using their territory for goods and services and lethal and non-lethal aid to transmit into is also an act of war. By the time he's finished with his list, scoring a goal on a Russian hockey team could be an act of war. And it strikes me that building our assumptions about whether an NFC is necessary or not is essentially saying we're going to take his word that if we do not bring in an NFC, that will stabilize his approach to further aggression in Europe. I would also make the case to Kerry and others that the most important thing going on now to defend freedom and democracy in Europe is the tremendous resistance of the Ukrainians on the ground, showing immense courage. And anything we can do to allow them to continue to slow down the Russian invasion, it strikes me as the most strategic and tactical thing we can do to make a positive difference. If we continue to let Putin dictate the tactics that we're prepared to use in support of a non-NATO country like Ukraine, which is fighting for its life, and in collaboration with neighboring NATO countries who are landing goods from Canada and other NATO countries and shipping them in we're going to run into a very, very difficult prospect, because there's no evidence that I can find in the last 6 months that anything he has said or promised not to do, like I have no plans to invade, one of the great lines from history, can be actually held up as any kind of structural justification for not giving the Ukrainians some measure of support. And I would point out that a former American ambassador to NATO, Kurt Voigt, has made the case that a limited no-fly zone over western and central Ukraine, with a clear "we will not fire on the Russians unless they fire on us first" position, may be a way in which you give the Ukrainians some chance for a tactical and strategic pause to keep up the battle. But I would suggest that the ultimate result without a no-fly zone is sadly very predictable. So I just leave that for the manifest panel to comment on any way that they can. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And Kerry,
So
if
Rosemary,
you could
can I
respond to the point you made with respect to one of your, I don't know whether you overlap, but the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, and his point about kind of a limited or a very defined no-fly zone. Could you respond to that and your perspective on whether it would still get us into a combat issue with NATO?
Yeah. So my starting point, first off, I'm not military, right? I've worked on war zones in war zones, on war zones for a long time, but I'm not military. But so my starting point is always that it's really bad for Ukraine. It's really bad for NATO if Ukraine loses this fight. And I understand it. And maybe the West will be pushed into a place where they have to think about no-fly zones. But they have been absolutely clear. You heard Jens Stoltenberg over the last few days after the Friday meeting, after the Leaders Summit. They're not contemplating it. And here's the reason, my analysis. For a no-fly zone to work in this environment, there have to be enough planes in the air and enough political will to shoot down enemy planes that violate the ban. And whether you're doing a limited no-fly zone over partial territory or trying to establish a no-fly zone over an entire country, you still need to know what your rules of engagement are. You need adequate surveillance. Do you stop the plane before it enters the airspace? Do you chase the plane down? Are you ready and willing to take that political decision to shoot Russians, to shoot Russian soldiers as NATO? And that is, I would argue, although the logic might sustain, that is very much escalatory when compared to saying to a sports, team that you can't play, or even to applying crippling sanctions. A political willingness to shoot down Russian planes and to shoot Russian soldiers risks war. It just does. So we're not actually handing that to President Putin, that decision. The decision is always with the enemy, whether they respond and escalate. But we would be leaving him absolutely no choice. And the only way to enforce a no-fly zone in this kind of hot war is to be willing to shoot down Russian planes. It seems to me, with a nuclear-armed Russia, that would be folly. And so that's why the push is on to provide Ukraine with those weapons, anti-aircraft, MiGs, etc., that would allow them to close their skies. It's these are two bad choices. But I made the point about NATO leaders' obligations as well to NATO allies, to their own citizens, because turning this into a Europe-wide war with a nuclear-armed Russia, if there's one thing worse than having Ukraine fall, it's having Europe embroiled in a wider hot war. The costs of that, are unimaginable right now. So I get the logic, but I'm kind of unshakable in my opinion on this. As I said, maybe things will get so bad that the West is moved into that position, but I don't see it happening right now. And this is me making my best estimate of where I think NATO might go from very much on the outside. I'm not inside now. I'm not government now. I'm just basing it on my years of experience with NATO decision making.
My name is John Bean. I'm the new director of the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History. So this is very much in our bailiwick because we try to bring together the academics with the practitioners. And it's nice to see you, Bob, again for the first time in 20 years. I did my doctorate here. Not in Russian history, but in Canada's relations with Asia. And I too am watching China pretty closely. Not only the friendship agreement that was reached between Putin and Xi Jinping, I think it was around the opening ceremony of the Olympics, but also thinking of also China's position of Taiwan, that if Russia is allowed to get away with taking Ukraine, what might be in store for Taiwan down the road? So it's a very unstable situation. When I was coming to this meeting, for me, I was fairly clear about NATO. We know what NATO is, and it's amazing to see how NATO's been galvanized, as you've heard today. My question is what's going on in Russia? Russia remains the mystery for us. The views of Russians toward what's going on, as you point out, the chances of some oligarchs or generals who seem to be surprised by even the mention of the nuclear option. I noticed a reaction of a couple of generals to Putin's remark as if it was the first they were hearing of it. I'm mindful of Rosemary's call to creative solutions. What we see unfolding before our eyes doesn't seem to be creative at all. It seems to be a massive game of chicken, which is getting scarier by the day. I agree with Hugh Siegel's point about we know the result of what will happen if the West doesn't come to Ukraine's defense, and we see the dangers of that. Will Putin stop with Ukraine? If he were to go into the Baltics, then those are NATO countries, and we are in I think Kerry said a third world war scenario. So Bob, you intrigued me by saying creative solutions about de-escalating conflict without giving into Putin's views or his very strange view of Russian history that he has expounded in a long article and more recently his very angry speech. So without conceding to that, is there a way of de-escalating this unfortunate situation? From the Russian point of view, the expansion of NATO was threatening. They see NATO as an offensive alliance, not a defensive alliance, which I don't agree with. But as a Russian expert, what could happen at this stage to possibly de-escalate the tension that is mounting by the day?
And the challenge is I'm a Russia expert only from the perspective of having dealt with them on some of the toughest issues, security issues, over the last couple of decades. So through the G8, when it was the G8, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm by no means the Russia expert, but I want to, so what would induce them to back away from conflict? I don't know, because, the whole arsenal of really robust sanctions were put out there as a deterrence. It didn't deter him one whit, and maybe it never would have. But, the West had to try. And whether I honestly think that NATO as an offensive alliance, NATO expansion, that's revisionist history. After a few of the former Soviet states had joined NATO, there was a BBC interview that Vladimir Putin did with David Frost, and he said two things. He said, I can't conceive of NATO ever being an enemy to Russia, and I won't discount the idea of Russia joining NATO. So before Crimea, if you went into the NATO cafeteria, you'd see Russian soldiers sitting having lunch with NATO soldiers in NATO headquarters. There was Russia participating in NATO operations, et cetera, et cetera. It was an uneasy cooperation, but it was cooperation. So him saying now it's all about NATO expansion, frankly, I think is revisionist history. Now, maybe he's changed his mind and gone into a darker place about NATO, but it is what it is. And I don't think putting on the table that idea that a state can't choose its own security alliances is the right way to go. But honestly, if Vladimir Zelensky wants to go there in order to save Ukrainians' lives, that's his call. So the principle isn't worth the lives of his citizens, but the principle is worth something for the West. The idea that might makes right is not good. That was the whole point of the alliance. So I don't think putting that on the table, especially if it's the alliance putting it on the table, will move Vladimir Putin, and I think it's not worth it. So what would move him? Even the Putin watchers right now, the people who've written biographies about him and tracked him for 30 years, can't begin to guess what'll move him off his path of destruction. I also think it's really tactically unwise to talk and policy unwise to talk about regime change, right? If anything is going to back a leader into a corner, that will do it. Maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't inside Russia, but to have Western governments opine about it is also not smart. I think the smartest thing right now is to send messages of understanding to the Russian people. And you'll see that from the head of state. They're being really careful and really smart in their messaging. They're reaching out to the Russian people, not to foment a color revolution. They're being extremely careful. That's not the plan. And it's, well, it never has been. And it's not the messaging, but they're sending that message to the Russian people, trying to get some of the truth in, right, about what's happening in Ukraine. So I honestly don't know what the answer is to get them to the table, because this war never made sense to me from I don't understand what he or Russia is getting out of it, unless it's pure ideology.
I would love to hear from the German ambassador. And can we go back to help us understand what happened last week when the new German chancellor made those 3 announcements I mentioned before, that the pipeline decision, the shipment of weapons, and the increase in foreign and defense spending. Can you help us out there?
NATO was created, as a former Secretary General said, to keep Russia out, the US in, and Germany down. And in the meantime, the whole rationale has changed. It is still now, and it's again now today, about keeping Russia out. But for a long time, we had a very different plan. We wanted to construct a security zone in Europe that would include Russia. And Putin's war, the 24th of February, will be that date that has pushed us all into a very new and harsh reality. And it's, for Germany, it has become the end of our illusions, our foreign and security policy illusions. And when on the last Sunday, Chancellor Scholz was standing in the German Bundestag, he was basically saying we have what he called a Zeitenwende, a sea change. The world is not the same anymore. And when the world changes, we need to change. And then he did change our foreign and security policy in a way we haven't seen before, in very sort of sober words, in his very sober way. He basically shifted policy on. We're delivering now lethal weapons to Ukraine. Germany, who's been very reluctant to deliver any kind of armament into conflict zone, is doing it. We've changed gear on the sanctions. These sanctions are the most comprehensive we've ever used. And they are affecting the Russian economy in a very significant way, in particular blocking of the central bank, who cannot use its reserves anymore, but also the trade blockade, where a lot of parts that are needed for production don't come into Russia anymore. So there's a whole list, and also the personal sanctions going after those who have enabled Putin to start this war of aggression. So all of that is very, very consequential. And Germany knows that the sanctions are going to hurt us too, and we're willing to pay that price. The third point, where we basically also changed gear, we've already been, since 2014, strengthening the eastern flank of NATO by being the lead nation in Lithuania, like the Canadians are in Latvia. But we're now beefing up our presence on very many fronts, including with the NATO response forces and with air surveillance. And then the last point, and a very important one, is we've changed gear, and we will change gear further when it comes to our energy supply. We need a secure energy supply. We have realized, maybe a little late, that security policy and energy policy go together very closely. And so the Chancellor made it very clear that Nord Stream 2 was not being built. He made it very clear that we're going to provide our country with different resources. And then the very last point was he also made it very clear that we're going to invest very significantly into providing greater security within Europe, within NATO, which means Germany is from this year on paying more than 2% of our GDP into defense. And Germany is setting up a fund of 100 billion euros in order to procure us with the kind of equipment we need in order to protect Europe and Germany better.
That's very helpful. Thank you so much for that. And I think that, there's bits and pieces of it, and understanding the context, especially as the new Chancellor, is very, very helpful. Can you just touch on the significance of the application last week of the Ukraine to join the European Union, and the very welcome kind of reception that received? Does that have implications in terms of how the EU would look at future obligations if an EU member was invaded by a non-EU member? Does that change the equation as well?
I don't think it changes the equation, but it is supposed to be a light at the end of the tunnel for the brave Ukrainians who are struggling and having to endure this terrible aggression. Accession to the EU is never a short process, and countries have to fulfill certain conditions. This is not the accession. This is saying we will look at the accession of Ukraine to the EU, but at the same time, it sort of accepts also that the Ukrainians are fighting for the values that Europe stands for. In practical terms, would it change the equation on security terms? Not right now, but it's a strong signal, it's a strong symbol. The EU theoretically has something like the Article 5 in its text as well. It's the article, I think, 42. But you see, the EU does not have a real defense force. Again, I think there is a sea change, and the EU will be now much, much more engaged, and has been very united and engaged in giving itself more instruments to defend itself, to defend its interests and values, beginning with the sanctions, but also with, for the first time, deciding to give 450 million euros to Ukraine in order to defend itself.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Let me just let you, the three of you, kind of do a little wrap in terms of things you think we should be taking away, and things we should be contemplating as this real-time crisis plays out on the front. And David, why don't I start with you, since we haven't seen or heard from you in a while?
I would really say, Rosemary, look, right now there's a race. There's a race between the ability of the Ukrainian people to withstand this brutal attack and the race for the sanctions to take their full course on Russia. And, I would place my money on the Ukrainian people. They've shown incredible strength. There's incredible leadership from President Zelensky. And it appears from certain signs that we're getting from the Russians that the sanctions are really starting to hurt. And I think that this is going to really force President Putin into coming to some reality.
That's a wonderful, optimistic note to land on. Thank you for that. Kerry, how about you?
If what David just said comes to pass, and I sincerely, sincerely hope it does, There may be space to rebuild the relationship with Russia. It'd be very difficult if Vladimir Putin's at the helm, but it's something important to think about the longer term. It's also important to think about Canada's place in NATO, right? So after the Second World War, Lester Pearson said that while it was understandable that during the Second World War we had to follow the lead of the UK and the US, in post-war architecture, that's unacceptable. And so we really pushed hard for NATO that had a political role, that had a decision-making function, and where Canada had a voice and a veto, voice at the table, and could really shape security decisions. So it's really important to think about how Canada uses that, what will happen to NATO over the medium term. And there may be a few other kind of knock-on longer term questions that, or results, if David's optimistic scenario points out, maybe the club of strongmen that have been gaining some strength, maybe that will start to fragment a bit. That'd be interesting. But we still, all of us in the West, need to think very carefully about how we shore up our own democracies, how we counter disinformation, how we, as Robert Baines said at the beginning, how we engage our own citizens in some very kind of educated discussions around security. And we in Canada have a discussion, a real discussion about what real security interests, security threats we have, and prepare better for them. So while I'm all consumed about the war right now, I'm also thinking about that medium-term results, or not results, but medium-term world and how Canada fits into it.
And Sabine, last word.
Everything both Kerry and David have said. I think the issue right now at the heart of the matter is whether power is allowed to prevail over the law, and whether we permit not just Putin but other leaders who might want to turn want to do the same, to turn back the clock to the 19th century and to the age where you could just divide up the world as you wanted. I think it's awful to watch what terrible losses this is inflicting on Ukraine, but also on Russia and on all of us right now. But I do believe that the unity that we have, the unity in NATO, the unity also in the G7 and in the EU, is our defining strength right now, and hopefully will allow us to prevail, and hopefully will allow us, as Kerry has pointed out, as we need to do, eventually return to dialogue.
Well, thank you. And we'll thank all three of you for that, because I think one of the things you all brought in the message is around the need for calm amid all of this carnage and heartbreak and the images we're seeing, is the need for strategic calm. And we're seeing that among the NATO leaders and among the friends and allies of Ukraine across the world, as hard as it is to stay calm and to try and keep things somewhat managed. And I think the other main point, and it was really our objective, Natalie and I, in wanting to pull everyone together, was, you have to have informed citizens, informed on our military alliances and what's possible and what's not possible, and the calculations behind that, the calculus of certain strategic places that we should or should not go. And I think that the panel certainly helps that in terms of what we're trying to do, and having a better informed citizenry that in fact gives us a much healthier, much more sustainable and healthy opportunity for strong democratic institutions and democratic processes. And so it all does come together that way. I think that things are moving so fast on the, we might look to reconvene you in a couple of weeks or a month. Kerry, you put it out a few months, and let's keep in touch on that. And we put this together with the NATO Association of Canada, with the CIC, and with the Bill Graham Center. So thank you very much for joining us on this, and thank you to all of the network at Massey who were calling for something like this. And So thank you again, and please stay tuned for upcoming Massey Dialogues. They're always interesting and always great food for thought. Thank you again.